What is success? Is it having the best skills or working the hardest? Or is success determined by the invisible forces that surround us every day? Today's story takes us to medieval Paris. In the aftermath of the Black Death, we will witness how a young merchant discovered that fortune and misfortune spread like plagues when his childhood friendship threatened to destroy everything he had built. With a lesson he learned from observing human contagion, he would develop a strategy to protect himself from the carriers of failure. This story will reveal the most dangerous secret of human nature, a secret discovered 700 years ago, but still affecting every relationship and partnership in today's interconnected world. It is not just diseases that spread from person to person, but attitudes, expectations, and the very patterns of success and failure themselves. In the winding streets of medieval Paris, where the scent of fresh bread mingled with the shadows of ancient cathedrals, and every corner held both promise and peril, there lived a truth more dangerous than any sword. In a world where fortune and misfortune spread from person to person like invisible contagions, the company you keep determines not just your reputation, but your very destiny. For when success and failure, joy and despair, opportunity and disaster all move through human networks like plagues, the wise learn to recognize the carriers before the infection spreads. The year was 1348. Just as the Black Death had finished ravaging Europe and left behind a world where survivors understood viscerally how quickly catastrophe could spread from one person to another. In this transformed landscape, a young merchant named Philippe de Montclair faced a challenge that would test not only his business acumen, but his understanding of the invisible forces that shape human fortune. At 31, Philippe possessed the commercial skills that marked him as competent in the complex world of medieval trade. He understood market dynamics, had developed relationships with reliable suppliers, and possessed the kind of analytical mind that could spot profitable opportunities in the chaos of post-plague recovery. But he had also inherited something that threatened to destroy everything he hoped to achieve: a business partnership with his childhood friend, Henri de Grimaud, whose presence seemed to attract misfortune like a lodestone attracts iron. Henri was not malicious or incompetent, quite the opposite. He was intelligent, hardworking, and possessed genuine expertise in textile manufacturing. But there was something about him that Philippe had begun to notice with growing unease. Wherever Henri went, things went wrong. Projects that should have succeeded encountered unexpected obstacles. Negotiations that seemed certain to close fell apart at the last moment. Partnerships that began with enthusiasm ended in acrimony and mutual recrimination. At first, Philippe had dismissed these patterns as mere coincidence. Every merchant faced setbacks, and the post-plague economy was notoriously unpredictable. But as months passed and the pattern continued to repeat itself, Philippe began to understand that he was witnessing something more systematic than random bad luck. Henri carried with him an atmosphere of pessimism, complaint, and barely contained resentment that influenced everyone around him in subtle but profound ways. The crisis reached its peak during the autumn of 1348, when Philippe and Henri were negotiating what should have been a highly profitable contract to supply wool to the Guild of Drapers. The guild masters were eager to secure reliable suppliers, the terms were generous, and Philippe's reputation in the wool trade was excellent. Everything pointed toward an easy and lucrative agreement. But Henri's presence at the negotiations transformed what should have been a straightforward business discussion into an exercise in frustration and mounting tension. He questioned every detail of the proposed contract, not out of legitimate concern, but from a reflexive suspicion that someone was trying to take advantage of them. He recounted stories of previous business deals that had gone badly, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and defensive. Most damagingly, he projected an air of desperation and neediness that made the guild masters uncomfortable and suspicious of the partnership's stability. By the end of the meeting, the guild masters had withdrawn their offer, citing concerns about the partnership's philosophical alignment with guild values. Felipe found himself not just without the contract, but with a damaged reputation that would make future negotiations more difficult. The guild masters had clearly formed the impression that Felipe's business was associated with the kind of negative energy and contentious attitudes they preferred to avoid. That evening, as Felipe walked through the narrow streets of the Marais district and reflected on the day's disaster, he experienced an epiphany that would transform not only his business approach, but his entire understanding of how success and failure actually spread through human networks. He realized that Henri's impact on their partnership was exactly analogous to how the plague had spread through Europe. One infected person could contaminate entire communities, turning healthy environments into sources of sickness and death. The comparison was not merely metaphorical. Felipe had observed that people who spent time around Henri began to adopt his pessimistic outlook, his tendency to focus on potential problems rather than opportunities, and his habit of interpreting neutral events as evidence of persecution or ill fortune. Even Felipe himself had begun to notice these patterns in his own thinking and behavior. The infection of negative thinking and expectation was real, measurable, and profoundly destructive. But recognizing the problem was only the beginning. Felipe now faced the most difficult decision of his business career: how to protect himself and his enterprise from the contagion of Henri's misfortune without destroying a friendship that went back to childhood. The medieval world placed enormous value on loyalty and personal bonds, and breaking a partnership for reasons that many would consider superstitious could damage Felipe's reputation almost as badly as continuing the association. The solution, when it finally emerged, required a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond simple business calculation. Felipe realized that he needed to engineer a separation that would appear to be Henri's choice rather than his own, and that would leave Henri's dignity intact while protecting Felipe's business from further contamination. Felipe began by carefully observing the patterns of Henri's negative influence, documenting exactly how his partner's presence affected negotiations, partnerships, and business relationships. What he discovered was that Henri's impact was not random, but followed predictable patterns based on specific behaviors and attitudes that created measurable negative outcomes. Henri had a tendency to begin conversations by mentioning problems, setbacks, or concerns, rather than opportunities or positive developments. He interpreted ambiguous statements in the most negative possible way and communicated those interpretations to others as if they were established facts. Most importantly, he seemed to derive a strange satisfaction from predicting failure and being proven right, even when those failures damaged his own interests. Armed with this understanding, Felipe began to implement a strategy of gradual separation that would protect his business while avoiding direct confrontation. He started by taking on solo projects that Henri's expertise didn't match, creating natural reasons for independent work. He began scheduling meetings with key clients at times when Henri was unavailable, gradually building relationships that were not contaminated by his partner's negative influence. But the real breakthrough came when Felipe realized that he could use Henri's own psychology against him. Henri's pessimistic outlook made him naturally suspicious of success and uncomfortable with optimistic projections. Felipe began to present new business opportunities in terms that would appeal to Henri's preference for caution and risk avoidance, making the most promising ventures seem too risky for someone of Henri's conservative temperament. The strategy worked perfectly. When Felipe presented the opportunity to expand into the luxury silk trade, a venture that required significant upfront investment but offered enormous profit potential, Henri's immediate response was to focus on everything that could go wrong. He enumerated the risks, questioned the market analysis, and predicted various scenarios for failure with the kind of detailed pessimism that had become his trademark. Felipe appeared to listen thoughtfully to these concerns, then suggested that perhaps Henri was right to be cautious, and that maybe this particular venture would be better suited to someone with a higher risk tolerance. He offered to pursue the silk trade independently, while leaving Henri to focus on their more established and conservative wool business, presenting this division as a way to protect Henri from exposure to unnecessary risk. Henri, true to his nature, was both relieved to avoid what he saw as a dangerous venture and secretly pleased to have his pessimistic analysis validated by his partner's apparent acceptance of his warnings. He agreed to the separation eagerly, convinced that he was protecting himself from Philippe's reckless optimism while maintaining control of the safer parts of their business. Within 6 months, the transformation in Philippe's business results was dramatic and undeniable. Negotiations that had previously stalled began to move forward smoothly. New partnerships developed naturally and organically. Most importantly, Philippe found that his own mindset had shifted from defensive pessimism to confident optimism, creating a positive feedback loop that attracted opportunities and collaborators who shared his more constructive outlook. The silk trade venture that Henri had considered too risky became one of the most profitable enterprises of Philippe's career. By importing luxury silks from Italian city-states and positioning them as exclusive products for the recovering French nobility, Philippe created a business that generated returns far exceeding anything he had achieved during his partnership with Henri. But more importantly, Philippe discovered that success, like misfortune, was indeed contagious. As his reputation for positive outcomes grew, he began to attract partners and clients who brought their own networks of successful relationships. These new associations created opportunities that led to additional successes, which in turn attracted even more positive connections. Felipe had essentially created the opposite of Henri's negative spiral, a virtuous cycle where good fortune attracted more good fortune. The contrast with Henri's continued struggles was stark and instructive. Despite his intelligence and technical competence, Henri found himself trapped in an increasingly narrow circle of disappointing outcomes and failed ventures. His wool business, which had seemed like the safer choice, gradually declined as his pessimistic outlook repelled potential customers and partners. More troubling, Henri seemed unable to recognize the role that his own attitudes and behaviors played in these outcomes, instead interpreting each failure as additional evidence that the world was fundamentally hostile to his success. Felipe began to understand that he had witnessed something profound about the mechanics of human fortune. Success and failure were not just individual achievements or failures, but social phenomena that spread through networks of relationships according to predictable psychological and social laws. Word of Philippe's transformation began to spread through Paris's merchant community, creating a case study that other ambitious traders found both fascinating and instructive. The story of the partnership that had been dissolved for reasons of incompatible business philosophies became a cautionary tale about the importance of choosing associates carefully. Though few understood the sophisticated psychological analysis that had actually guided Philippe's decision, other merchants began to seek Philippe's advice about their own business relationships, and he found himself consulted not just on matters of trade and commerce, but on questions of partnership selection and relationship management. What Philippe had learned about the contagious nature of attitudes and expectations proved to be applicable far beyond his own specific situation. Philippe developed a systematic approach to evaluating potential partners and associates that went far beyond traditional considerations of competence and reliability. He learned to assess people's habitual patterns of thinking, their default assumptions about how the world worked, and their emotional reactions to uncertainty and challenge. Most importantly, he developed the ability to recognize the early warning signs of what he privately called misfortune carriers. People whose presence reliably created negative outcomes, regardless of their technical abilities or conscious intentions. This expertise made Philippe not just successful in his own ventures, but valuable as an advisor to other merchants who wanted to avoid the kind of toxic partnerships that could destroy years of careful work. His reputation for understanding the human dynamics of business success attracted clients who paid premium fees for insights that they couldn't find anywhere else. The ultimate validation of Philippe's approach came during the winter of 1351, when a severe economic downturn created challenges for merchants throughout northern France. While many businesses failed and partnerships dissolved in mutual recrimination, Philippe's carefully curated network of positive relationships proved remarkably resilient. His associates responded to the crisis, not with panic and blame, but with collaborative problem-solving and mutual support. Instead of competing desperately for scarce opportunities, they shared information and resources that helped everyone navigate the difficult period more effectively. The relationships Philippe had built based on shared optimism and constructive thinking created a kind of collective immunity to the negative spiral that destroyed less carefully managed business networks. Meanwhile, Henri's business collapsed entirely during this same period. His tendency to interpret setbacks as evidence of persecution and his habit of responding to challenges with complaints and accusations alienated the few partners and clients who had continued to work with him. When he most needed support and collaboration, he found himself isolated and blamed for problems that extended far beyond his control or responsibility. The contrast reinforced Philippe's understanding that in times of crisis, people's underlying attitudes and emotional patterns become magnified and more consequential. Those who carried the contagion of negative thinking not only failed to thrive, but actively undermined their own survival prospects by repelling the very relationships that might have helped them weather the storm. Years later, when Philippe had become one of the most successful merchants in Paris, and his approach to relationship management had influenced an entire generation of French traders, he would reflect on the medieval wisdom that had guided his transformation. The lesson was not about being cruel or heartless toward those who struggled with misfortune, but about understanding that some forms of negative thinking and behavior were literally infectious and had to be treated with the same caution that people used to avoid physical diseases. Misfortune, Philippe would tell younger merchants who sought his guidance, spreads exactly like the plague. It moves from person to person through close contact. It weakens everyone it touches, and it can destroy entire communities if it's not recognized and contained. The compassionate response is not to expose yourself and others to infection, but to maintain your own health so that you can help from a position of strength. This philosophy extended beyond business relationships to every aspect of Philippe's life. He learned to recognize and avoid people whose habitual patterns of thinking and emotional reaction created negative outcomes, not just for themselves, but for everyone around them. This didn't mean abandoning people who faced temporary setbacks or legitimate challenges, but rather distinguishing between situational difficulties and the kind of chronic psychological patterns that acted as carriers of contagious misfortune. The approach proved so effective that it influenced French merchant culture for generations. The understanding that attitudes and expectations were contagious became embedded in the way successful traders evaluated potential partners, selected employees, and structured their business relationships. In our modern world of global networks and instant communication, this medieval wisdom has become more relevant than ever. We live in an age where negative thinking and toxic attitudes can spread through social media, workplace cultures, and personal relationships with unprecedented speed and reach. The ability to recognize and protect ourselves from psychological contagion has become essential not just for business success, but for personal well-being and mental health. The most successful entrepreneurs, leaders, and professionals of our time are those who have learned to apply the same principles that guided Felipe over 6 centuries ago. They understand that success and failure, optimism and pessimism, constructive and destructive attitudes all spread through human networks according to predictable patterns. And they make conscious choices about the kind of psychological environment they create and participate in. This doesn't mean being unsympathetic to people who face genuine challenges or temporary setbacks, but rather recognizing that some patterns of thinking and behavior are toxic to everyone involved and must be addressed through boundaries rather than through increased exposure. The most caring response to chronic negativity is often to maintain enough distance to preserve your own psychological health while encouraging the other person to seek appropriate help for patterns that are destructive to their own interests. Whether you're building a business, advancing in your career, maintaining personal relationships, or simply trying to create a positive and productive life, the principles of psychological contagion remain as important today as they were in medieval Paris. Choose your associates carefully, recognize the early warning signs of toxic thinking patterns, and remember that protecting yourself from negative influences is not selfish, but essential, both for your own success and for your ability to help others from a position of strength and stability. For in the narrow streets of medieval Paris, Philippe de Montclair learned that the greatest threat to human flourishing is often not external circumstances, but the internal attitudes and expectations that spread invisibly from person to person, creating either virtuous cycles of success and positivity or destructive spirals of failure and despair. And in that understanding lies a timeless secret of protection. True compassion sometimes requires distance, and the greatest service you can provide to others is the example of what positive thinking and constructive action can accomplish.